Hello everyone. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Marlene Sahakian. I'm at the University of Geneva, and I have the pleasure to be co-chairing this panel one with Marta Lopez here, my colleague at Cumbria in Portugal, on the dynamics of consumption. And we've oriented the theme for this summer study around the notion of energy consumption and well-being. We had some great talks yesterday that made clear links between well-being and energy usage and energy services. And today we're going to focus on questions related to diversity and inclusion or exclusion and how to deal with that in relation to energy usage. So we have three speakers with us today. They each have 15 minutes to present. So without further ado, I give the floor to Rihab Khalid, who will present Gendering Practices and Policies in the South, Lessons for Improved Equity and Sustainability in Pakistan's Domestic Energy Sector. We look forward to hearing from you, Rihab. I don't have any sound. I don't know if that's the case for others.
Apologies for that. Let me just try and start that one again. Bear with me.
No problem. Thank you so much, Liz, for your support.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Rihab Khalid, Research Fellow at Lucy Cavendish College, University of Cambridge. And the title of my talk today is Gendering Practices and Policies in the South, Lessons for Improved Equity and Sustainability in Pakistan's Domestic Energy Sector. So my talk today is based on the paper written by myself and my colleague, Dr. Chris Foles from Global Sustainability Institute, Anglia Ruskin University. So let me begin with an introduction to the project. Now, our paper is based on the ARU Global Challenges Research Fund project titled Gendering the Construction of Energy Needs in the Global South, that aims to investigate how access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy, which is the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 7, is constructed by professional actors and with what implications for gender equality, which is SDG 5, in the Global South. This project is based on a collaboration of 11 partners across 6 countries, focusing on 4 case study areas, conducting 86 interviews across these to deliver 4 policy briefs. Of these, I'm going to present the preliminary findings for Pakistan today. Just to give you a quick background context, Pakistan, like many countries in the South, faces rapid urbanization and economic growth under critical challenges of climate change. The country is heavily reliant on fossil fuels, with about 30% of its population still without access to electricity. And the country faces critical challenges in its off-grid rural electrification. As for gender, Pakistan has still a long way to go to achieve gender equality and women's equal economic participation. Now, most women-related policies and programs in the last few decades have focused on supporting legislation to prevent violence, while less attention has been given to gender mainstreaming in the socio-economic and political arenas. So our data collection for the project included 21 semi-structured interviews with energy sector professionals from policy bodies, regulatory authorities, electric utilities, NGOs, development authorities, as well as delivery services, to understand their experiences and expectations of gender equity in Pakistan's energy policy and practice. Moving to the research frame, so our research was guided by three theoretical concepts which form a point of departure for the preliminary analysis. The first is a practice theoretical approach to domestic energy consumption, in which energy demand is conceptualized as an outcome of social practices, and in which professional and household practices are dynamically interconnected and determine energy use. And following on from a constructivist approach, gender is thought to be performed in the carrying out of energy consuming practices. Secondly, we take an intersectional approach to gender, moving beyond a binary to focus on the intersections of gender with other social categories of difference, such as income, class, race, etc., and how these come to define power relations. And third, we take gender equity as a form of energy justice, taking a practice theoretical approach to Walker and Day's three tenets of justice: distributional justice, that is fair access to essential energy practices; recognition, that is acknowledging intersectional differences and diversities in practice performances, particularly of vulnerable and marginalized social groups; and procedural justice, that is participation in decision-making practices. So coming to the findings now, we started by analyzing participants' perceptions of the gendered nature of domestic energy use, focusing on differences between men and women and between different groups of women. So participants highlighted the gendered nature of energy practices in terms of the division of labor between men and women. Men are considered head of the households and breadwinners of the family, whereas women are traditionally responsible for most household chores, such as cooking, cleaning, laundering, household management, and caregiving. There was a clear distinction between women's work-related use of energy, such as in household chores, but also in undertaking economic home-based income-generating practices, such as tailoring and sewing, while men's use of energy at home was related to practices such as comfort, convenience, and entertainment. Women were also seen as better managers of and more responsible for energy use and efficiency. Of course, not all women were seen to use energy the same way, and participants clearly recognized intersectional differences in energy access between different women, such as from different incomes, classes, and education levels, but also in their geographical locations, such as in the urban and rural divide. So in part, differences were related to unequal infrastructure development, which means that women in rural areas spend greater times in collecting fuel wood, water, and cooking that involves greater drudgery, whereas high-income urban women are seen to have greater freedom of movement and access to technologies like mobile phones, computers, televisions, and other household goods. Some of the key takeaways from the expert interviews were that distributional energy access is partly the result of patriarchal sociocultural norms that marginalize women's energy needs, and cultural norms of purdah that entail a socio-spatial division of private and public spheres further skews distribution. But all three forms of injustices were evidenced in the gendered access to energy, not just distributional injustices, but also a lack of recognition of women's economic participation through home-based income-generating activities, and procedural injustices in women's lack of participation in decision-making practices. So although women were seen to use more energy at home, this didn't translate into greater control, since it's still the men who are responsible for most energy-related decision-making and finances. So looking at some of the implications for equitable energy access in policy, the first is moving beyond gender neutrality. Now, some of the key challenges for gender mainstreaming identified during the interviews were: first, most participants believed in the gender neutrality of energy policy. Although they acknowledged differential gender needs that should be considered in the implementation of policy, they were unable to recognize the adverse effects of genderless policies. For example, one female participant from a development authority said that policy should be genderless and that measures should be incorporated regardless of whether they are related to females or males. Secondly, the understanding of gender went only so far as to address the gender division of labor, overlooking its social construction, resulting in an absence of emphasis on challenging existing gender norms. And third, for most participants, the dominant perception was that gender differences don't exist in terms of access, but only in terms of the demand for energy. And while the first is considered part of their remit, the latter does not factor into organizational roles and responsibilities. For example, one participant, a male participant from an electric utility, said that gender inequity is more related to the use of energy after access is provided. There are certainly differences in usage, but in providing electricity, I don't think there is really a difference. So this divide results in a disconnect between gender-neutral policy objectives and on-ground gender-biased energy outcomes in which women's needs and access to energy remains marginalized. This means that there is a need to integrate energy access with its use. And for this, practice theory provides a useful framing of consumption as shaped by and shaping energy production and provision. Now, there are two things here that need greater attention. The first is addressing the knowledge gap and lack of information on energy access and its distributional and intersectional impacts. For example, through data on women's energy needs. But also to better address women's needs, there need to be more women making decisions in energy policy and practice. So let's look at these 2 points in greater detail. The first is determining the right scale and scope of intervention. Now we know that there is an uneven distribution of resources between household members, and so policy should move beyond the household as its unit of observation. So disaggregated intra-household data is required to understand the diversities of demand and intersectional differences. For example, by collecting data on the why, where, who, and what of domestic household practices. And to collect this data, there need to be more field-level extension workers in ministries of energy that ensure meaningful engagement with both men and women, for instance, in collecting gendered field data. For example, one participant highlighted how, in her experiences, focus group discussions work better with men who are generally more assertive and outspoken about their needs, compared to women with whom observations and ethnographies worked better. Also, being more reflexive in designing interventions to ensure women's needs are given priority, but without overlooking the relational aspects of gender that can risk alienating men from the conversation, because in most cases, they're the ones holding the purse strings. As one participant said, if you're appealing to or orienting a product just to women, then that might not work because your customer is still going to be the men. And if they're not targeted, that's bad marketing. And so marketing interventions that highlight benefits for both women and men can have greater success. Moving on to women's participation in decision-making to overcome procedural injustices. Now, as mentioned earlier, in Pakistan, women remain underrepresented in the energy sector with limited participation in planning and policy decision-making. And some of the key challenges in this regard identified by the interviews include lack of enabling environments and adequate infrastructure and facilities, and the prevalence of patriarchal norms that inhibit women's economic participation. Women are often overlooked for certain roles considered more suited to men, such as site visits, fieldwork, travel to remote areas, and engagement with male community representatives. Now, this absence of women employed in fieldwork can then limit engagement with women end users and inhibit data collection from female members of the community, as one female participant highlighted how her male team members could not interact with the women during their site visits. This means that interventions are needed in the interlinked practice elements, such as developing women's competences, providing essential material infrastructures such as separate washroom facilities or safe transportation, but also challenging masculine imaginaries of certain professional responsibilities. For example, some participants shared success stories of how by taking on traditionally masculine roles such as meter reading or as Roshna Bibis, translated as light women, that act as community solar power managers, women had been able to challenge normative cultural perceptions and improve energy access for their communities. So, coming to the conclusions now, there are three key takeaways. The first is to make visible the integrated nature of energy access and demand through interventions that target gendered practices and gendered technologies by collecting disaggregated intra-household practice-based data. Secondly, our study shows that focusing on the nexus of gendered practices, energy access, and justice shows promising pathways to improve energy equity and sustainability. So combining practice theory with intersectionality and energy justice frameworks can help overcome the knowledge gaps and reveal power dynamics in gender relations that are manifest through practice performances. And finally, gender equity in energy access can be achieved when energy policies factor in non-energy but related social policies, such as gender-sensitive urban planning and development, or health-related policies for women's social, psychological empowerment and well-being, as well as innovative social initiatives that challenge prevailing gender norms and gender relations for improved equity. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your time, and I welcome your questions and feedback.
Thank you so much, Rehab, for that lovely presentation. Very, very illustrative as well with those very cool visuals. So there's already a question from Marta. Marta was asking, how about behaviors related with investment practices, and who decides which technologies to buy? For example, what laundry machine to buy or television, etc. Are there also gender differences in relation to purchasing decisions?
Thanks so much, Marlene. And thanks, Martha, for the question. So I think what we found out from the interviews was that decision-making in all aspects related to energy consumption is very much male-dominated, specifically when we're talking about financial decisions. So decisions wherever, which are related to any form of finance, because in most cases, it is the men who are earning and who have control of the finances. And so they're the ones who are making the decisions. So although women are the ones who are using more energy at home because they're the ones who are actually performing these practices, but at the end of the day, when it comes to decision making, it's still very much male dominated.
Yeah, thank you. And what about a question from Nazifa Rafa, I guess, which came through WUVA. In your research, have you come across variations in adaptive capacities between genders when it comes to lack of adequate energy access?
Thanks, Nazifa, for the question. I'm a bit unclear about what you mean by adaptive capacities. We didn't specifically ask questions around that. But one of the ideas that does come across is that whenever there is limited energy available, so there's, energy access is limited, its impact is seen more for women because they're the ones who are responsible for most of the household chores. So I think in that sense, they would have to be more adaptive because they have to actually perform the chores and make sure that everything is running. And the other thing is that for men, if, for example, if they don't have enough energy access at home, they do have alternative options. So it's easier for them to, for example, leave the house and then, go to a community facility, a public space, and to access, energy, which is available there. So for women, because they are, in most cases, they are confined in the house. And again, there are differences between urban and rural contexts. So women's mobility is seen to be much more restricted and perceived to be much more restricted in the rural sectors. So they are more confined within within their houses, and so they would perhaps have less opportunities to access energy in that way. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. And I like the way you brought together these three theoretical frameworks. So practice theory, the justice, and also intersectionality, of course, related to gender. And I appreciate that you didn't do household interviews necessarily, right? You were at this level looking at experts. Are you planning on doing any household interviews? Because I would be interested in any microdynamics around power, let's say forms of resistance, or when women don't play the role that they are usually assigned to, what happens? And what does that tell us about energy? Are you planning more field work, Rehab?
Yeah, so I mean, this was a one-year project, and we were focusing on professional experts and their experiences. The idea was that we wanted to kind of connect household practices with the professional practices of energy, access. And it was interesting because, these are connected together, and it's so difficult to form these connections. I mean, what I found was that a lot of the professionals had this idea that it wasn't a part of their remit to understand demand because they were providing access. And so there is this division. And certainly, so in my own work within my junior research fellowship, the whole idea is to actually do some ethnographic research, to do interviews with women on ground. So my focus would be on the urban scale, but still the idea is to focus on different classes and income groups to understand how women from different, formal and informal settlements have access to energy and how they kind of traverse the socio-spatial divisions that do exist in the society. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that, we move beyond the pandemic restrictions and I'm able to do that field work.
Yeah, that would be great. I see there are other people here who are also familiar with the practice framework. Nathalie Hortard is with us. Did you find that social practice theory was relevant and useful when you were talking to these policymakers and other experts? How did you explain the approach to them? And did they understand this approach in a world that tends to be dominated by an individual behavioral approach to understanding energy usage?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So we didn't, we didn't even try to explain it to them because, I mean, it would have been quite difficult. It's a very, complex theoretical concept. So the way that we approached it was to frame our questions in a way that we were asking them about household practices. So the idea was for us to understand, what their perceptions were in terms of differences in household energy use in terms of practices. So we explicitly asked them about cooking, for instance. So, who they understand does the cooking, what technologies are used and what are the differences in terms of technology use or energy access. So the framing of the research was very much guided by the practice theory framework. I mean, it did really depend on the professionals, how they interpreted the question. So some would, go into the details of different types of practices. The idea with behavior was, again, it didn't really come across because, for one thing, we were talking more about energy access. So the focus was very much on energy provision. So it was more around the grid infrastructure, the technologies, the off-grid micro generations or solar home solutions. And so, the participants would kind of revert to those measures because they were basically from the energy provision sector. And so behavior change, because it is so much more associated with the demand side, it wasn't something that came up quite intuitively. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. And I guess related to that, Nathalie Hortard is asking, are you also planning on studying questions of access, energy usage in terms of access? So I guess access to different forms of energy, maybe?
So I mean, I'm very much in the research design phase at the moment for my own research that will follow on from this. The idea for me is to focus more on electricity, because I mean, when we're talking in the urban sector, it is very much grid. It's on the grid, and so apparently there's an electricity connection. But then, even within that, there's lots to show that it doesn't mean that it's reliable, it's available. The quality varies across, let's say, the urban slums and the more, planned upper income groups. So my focus is going to be more on electricity, but I mean, I'm going to keep it open just to ensure that I can take note of fuel stacking where it does exist, because obviously, clearly it does.
Yeah, great. And maybe the studies we heard yesterday on Namibia and other studies from the global south linking well-being to energy usage could be relevant to you.
Definitely.
So thank you, Rehab, so much. It was lovely to hear your presentation and discuss with you. And I now pass the baton to Anna Realini, who will be discussing the question of energy poverty in a changing climate, the challenge of hot homes. Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marlene. I hope everybody can see my screen. The presentation is about a work we performed with a couple of colleagues in our company, that is Ricerca sul Sistema Energetico, that is a public Italian company working on research about energy systems mostly for the government. In particular, we belong to the research group of energy efficiency. The idea of energy poverty has been in our continent, at least from 1991, with the issue of cold homes defined in England, mostly related to heating due to the fact that in England the climate is quite cold and wet. So the main issue was to be able to heat your own house. But in the last years, this concept has been focused also on some other issues. Also, the European Union recently published some documents about this. And we have to consider also other aspects, especially cooling, electric appliances, and sustainable mobility. So the definition of energy poverty has evolved from the inability to properly heat your home to the inability to purchase a minimum set of energy goods and services, with consequences of consumers' physical and mental health. In particular, considering the changing climate, our group has decided to focus on cooling for the moment. In particular, you can see that there has been a high temperature increase in the last years. Everybody knows that in Europe, but overall in the world. And especially in Italy, we have considered the increase in cooling degree days from 1979 to 2020, and there is a 43% average increase in cooling degree days. So the climate is changing, it's hotter and hotter, and we have a more serious issue that is represented by the increase in number and frequency of heat waves. Here are reported just a couple of examples with two different emission scenarios, but as we can see, especially in Southern Europe, but sometimes also in Northern Europe, the frequency and the intensity of heat waves will be increasing in the next 50 to 80 years. This can have serious health consequences. That the first is premature death, so excess mortality, that is not reported in the slide, but of course has to be considered, but also some serious health consequences that can lead to hospitalization or to chronicity, that can go from respiratory issues to cardiac and circulatory issues, dehydration, heat stroke, and also for pregnant ladies, premature baby delivery and fetal death. So we have to understand how to ensure that people adequately cool their homes, especially, as I stated, during heat waves. We follow the methodology that we defined, in which we started with a literature review. So we understood which data we had available and which were the most appropriate energy poverty indicators to use, because there are a bunch of energy poverty indicators that consider different aspects. Then we proceeded with the calculation of minimum energy needs for different types of buildings. In the Italian case, a software that was developed by RSC some years ago considered 140 typical buildings. Then the energy needs were converted into expenses and compared with a database that reported statistical income and or expenses, thus calculating the energy poverty indicator and letting us analyze the characteristics of energy poor households. So for cooling, there is no indicator, or at least there are two indicators that are exactly one that are reported, one by EPOV, the Energy Poverty Observatory of the European Commission, that reports that 79% of European people are comfortably cooled during summertime. But as we can see, this is right for Northern Europe. The percentage goes down for Southern Europe, especially in the Mediterranean area, but also in Portugal. And then there is EDEPI, that is an index that was developed by OpenExp that considers different aspects of energy poverty, and in this winter discomfort is considered. I said, as you can see, Italy is not well positioned in terms of overall energy poverty index, but also in terms of winter discomfort. The percentage is quite high. I said that there are two indexes, but actually there is one, because both these indexes consider European statistics that was updated in 2012. And the second problem is that it's subjective. So they asked people, do you feel comfortably cool during summertime? Yes, no, and they calculated this index. And we need something more objective, something that can be calculated also considering the energy needs and not just people's preferences or a composite index. So we propose to use an indicator that is derived from the Italian National Energy Strategy, but is slightly modified because in Italy we have a big issue in calculating energy poverty indicators. Historically, energy poverty indicators have considered the problem of expenditure over income, the low income, high cost indicator. The issue is that in Italy, we don't have statistics reporting income associated to energy expenditures. So we use what is used in Italy to define a family in poverty, that is the household budget investigation performed by the Italian Statistical Institute, in which being poor or rich is associated with the expenditure that a family is able to perform in a year that is divided then by month. So the Italian National Energy Strategy defines in energy poverty those families for which the overall expenditure minus the minimum heating expenditure makes the family goes below the threshold for poverty definition. We changed the definition of the indicator, including a minimum energy indicator, so considering also heating and cooling needs of the family, and includes also the installation and maintenance costs of a cooling system, because more than 64% of Italian families don't have a cooling system yet. So this is, let's say, how we calculated the minimum energy needs. We use this software called Carapace that was developed by a colleague some years ago, in which we defined 140 building types, depending on the building type. So it's single family, multi-family, small condominium, large condominium. The climatic zone, in Italy we have 6, but one is just for like 3,000 people living on a small island, so we considered 5. And the building age, we divided it into 7 building ages, depending on the construction materials and the types of buildings that were typical of that age in a different zone. To this, we associated the weather data of 2015, the comfort settings that were defined as per the Italian legislation, heating at 20 degrees, cooling at 26 degrees, so no more than 20, not less than 26. And we decided the switch on and switch off times of the heating and cooling. So when during the year it could be allowed to switch on heating and cooling according to the climatic zone, considering the reference laws and standards for Italy that are again the Italian legislation, the decree of the President of the Republic 74/2013, and the standard UNITS 11,300. Once minimum energy needs were calculated, these had to be translated into a minimum energy expenditure. So we considered average efficiencies for a natural gas boiler for heating, that is what is used mostly in Italy for heating, and for heat pumps for cooling. And we considered electricity and natural gas prices in euros per kilowatt hour once the minimum energy need was translated in a minimum energy consumption. In this way, we calculated the minimum energy expenditure for cooling and heating for the 140 buildings of the software. Then we inserted those calculations in the Istat Household Budget Survey, in which for 15,000 families that are representative of the Italian family population, we know the type of building, location, the age, and the area. So it was possible to calculate the minimum energy expenditure for that type of family. And we got it for these 15,000 families. Then these had to be translated, then the energy poverty index had to be calculated. So we took the household budget of these 15,000 households, we removed from it the minimum energy expenditure, and for those families that didn't have an HVAC system, so they didn't have, cooling system, we added the installation and maintenance cost to the indicator. So we defined whether each of these 15,000 families were or not in energy poverty. Once they were defined, we had to analyze how energy poor families were composed. So we calculated that considering only heating, around 3.3 million of families were in energy poverty, corresponding to 9.6 million consumers. So 13% of the families, 16% of the consumers. If we added cooling to these, we arrived to 3.8 million families and 10.6 million consumers, so 15% and 18%. Thus, with an increase of around 500,000 families and 1 million consumers due to the installation, maintenance, and running of the cooling system. As you can see in the graph, the composition and distribution, the yellow bar is the bar related to non-energy poor, while the green bar is the number of energy poor households, the distribution of the energy poor households just for heating, and the blue bar is for heating and cooling. As you can see, on average, non-energy poors are mostly small families and less big families, while energy poor are more concentrated in the highest part of this number of people living in the family. And as you can see, however, when we start considering cooling, the average size of the family that is energy poor decreases because more single people and couples become energy poor than big families, let's say. The second characteristic we analyzed was the energy expenditure, so over the overall expenditure of the family. So as an average Italian, we have around that the total energy expenditure, considering both heating and cooling, is around 6.9% for the average Italian family. But if we consider the non-energy poor households, their expenditure is around 6.4, and just the energy use expenditure is 3.8. Then we have to add, of course, the purchase and installation of cooling system and the maintenance. When we go to energy poor households, this percentage of the expenditure increases to almost 15%, where energy is quite heavy, is more than half, 8.5%, but a great increase is also in the purchase and installation of the cooling system and the maintenance, the yearly maintenance of the cooling system. If we consider the building age or the age of the buildings, we can see that there is no big difference between non-energy poor and energy poor families, but also between the just heating and cooling case. The only difference is that more non-energy poor people live in more recent buildings, so those built after 1990, but especially those built after 2006, mostly because of the cost of these modern buildings that are more efficient, so less energy poor, less people that are poor can afford to live in such types of buildings. And if we consider ownership, however, we have a big difference in the distribution because non-energy poor tend more to live in their own house, while energy poor tend to be more renting houses or having them in free use, for example, live in social housing where they can have it for free or with a very low rental. If we consider the urban context, the distribution is almost the same. We have a slight difference between the rural areas. So we have less energy poors, less non-energy poors in the rural area and more energy poors in the rural area. and of course more non-energy poor in cities and less energy poor in cities, while if we consider the suburbs, the distribution is almost equal, and there's no significant difference between just heating or heating and cooling. And then we go to the end, we have the distribution in Italy. If we consider just the heating case, the distribution is unbalanced towards southern Italy. This is mostly due to the fact that in southern Italy also poverty is much higher than in northern Italy. Industry is less developed, there is a higher rate of unemployment, a much higher rate of women that are unemployed. So even if heating is less needed in the southern areas, it's however, there is however a problem of energy poverty. The same happens with heating and cooling, so the trend is almost the same with heating and cooling. But if we consider the difference between just heating and cooling, we can see that the difference is much more in northern and central Italy, especially in those regions that have, for example, Piedmont or Trentino Alto Adige, Sud Tyrol, where there is a lower penetration of cooling systems in the households, because historically climate was colder than in other areas. There are a lot of mountains. While, for example, if we go to the northern Italy, but in regions where there is a flat area, the central flat area of Pianura Padana, cooling systems are much more spread. So there, this problem is less evident. And so we have to understand why in these areas the problem with cooling arises. Finally, some conclusions. The overall impact of cooling is that if we add cooling to the equation of energy poverty in Italy, more than 500,000 households become energy poor. And the cooling is mostly a burden related to installation and maintenance costs, because energy costs remain limited also for energy poor households. They are around 1% of the overall budget of the family, while installation is quite heavy, is around 5%. And if we consider that the installation costs are spread over 2 years, we spread installation costs over 2 years, but maintenance is something that you have to do every year for a long time. Also, maintenance can be quite heavy, is more than 1.5%. As I said a minute ago, the higher impact is in northern Italy, especially because less air conditioning systems are installed, and climate is, however, changing and becoming hotter and hotter with more heat waves, especially. And in Italy, still, we don't have specific financial measures that are considering cooling degree days. Household composition is partially considered, and also urban context. Moreover, the financial measures are just supporting people in paying their energy bills, but not acting against energy inefficiency. So making a house more efficient is still has still a high cost, and it's not yet adequately addressed for energy poor consumers. So the amount and accessibility for energy poor consumers is quite limited because they have to already have some money to start renovating their house. The next steps of this research is the estimate of energy poverty evolution to 2050 and possible to 2100. This is more difficult because the software and the model we use now is asking very precise climate data. We will have to modify it slightly to take into account the different scenarios and the lack of data, of course, because these are scenarios to 2050 and 2100. A deeper evaluation of policy implication also in the light of COVID, because the policies have changed quite a lot in the last year, and also with the European Green Deal, there are more proposals for energy poverty. So we have to understand how the implication of this policy are impacting energy poor people. We are already doing an evaluation of health impacts of energy poverty, also to understand the cost for the national health system, due to the fact that energy poor people are getting ill more frequently and more seriously than non-energy poor people, especially considering some types of pathologies. And then we would like to complement this study with social studies. Our company is not equipped with social study people, but we have already cooperated for some other projects about energy poverty with other companies. So we would like to understand a full characterization of energy vulnerable households, also going into their homes. We have done it in previous projects, we will do it in the future. Thank you very much for attending, and if you have any question, you can ask them now, or you can find all the email address and the website in the last slide. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you for your talk. We went a little bit over time, but since we only have 3 papers here, it's perfectly fine. So we have 2 questions that that I can collapse into one. So you've developed an indicator based on an active system for cooling, HVAC. What about buildings with passive cooling strategies? Specific, that might be featured through architectural features like shading or wind tunnels and this kind of thing. Are you considering to further develop your indicator to include these types of approaches? What might be the limitations? And similar to that, Rehab is asking, what type of cooling mechanisms were considered for the estimate? Were different passive techniques or low cooling technologies compared?
Okay, so we considered only active system because in our model we consider the energy expenditure, but the eventual possibility to have a passive system was considered actually in the software, because as I said, we modeled these 140 types of buildings, and these buildings are already including the energy efficiency requirements and needs given by the regulations and legislation in Italy. So for those, for example, built after 2006, the insulation systems were already considered in the calculation of the energy need that was then transformed with the active system into energy consumption. Of course, we haven't considered the latest features yet, but it won't be considered if we keep this indicator, it won't be considered directly in the indicator, but it will be considered in the energy need, then consumption, then energy expenditure, of course, related to the fact that if we have passive cooling, insulation, and other techniques, the possibility is that the energy need, the cooling need of the building becomes 0 or very close to 0. So the active system won't be needed to cool the building. So there will be 0 expense for cooling. And so the family will not have to pay for their electricity related to cooling.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks so much. What about, can you tell us something about the tenant or owner structure of homes? So when it comes to maintenance, for example, do most people own their homes in Italy? And is it easy for people to get subsidies to invest in renovations? Or is it more of a tenant leasing system?
Okay, in Italy, lots of people own their home, as was on the almost last slide, but most of non-energy poor own their homes. It's like almost 80%, while energy poor, around 50% of energy poor live in rented houses or in free use houses that are given by not the government, municipalities, social services, and so on. The main issue to access energy efficiency renovation financial subsidies is related to the fact that also tenants could access them. But what's the interest of a tenant to perform a building renovation when the building is not yours?
Exactly, yeah.
And the other problem is, what's the interest of the owner that is renting a house to perform building renovation when you are not benefiting from this building renovation, but just spending a lot of money?
Yes, yeah.
In the last years in Italy, we have had this system where you pay for your own home renovation, and then you can ask a refund on your taxes for split in 10 years, but this covers from 50 to 85% of the expenditure, depending on the type of intervention, the type of house, whether it's a single family or a condominium, and so on. So you, however, need to have some initial money to start your building renovation. You can't do it if you don't have any money. You can also ask the bank to anticipate some of the money, and your tax refund can be given directly to the bank, but the issue is that it doesn't cover 100% of the expenditure. So for rich people, for average people, this might be accessible, but for an energy pool that doesn't have an income or has a very low income, pays a very low amount of taxes and probably is not eligible for a credit from the financial institution or from the bank, this becomes almost impossible.
Yes, yeah.
Last year, however, COVID helped us, let's say, because the Italian government started a policy where you can, just for home renovation related to energy efficiency, you can get up to 110% of the expenditure back with the tax refund. The issue is that the bureaucracy to access this is quite complex. And the other issue is related to the fact that if you are living in a rented house, you have no interest and the owner has no interest in performing building renovation.
Yeah.
Quite complex. And the third issue is that it covers only the part related to energy efficiency. So if you have to perform some extra works to renovate your building, this is not covered by this subsidy. And so you still have to have some money or access some credit to perform it. And finally, it's temporary, it's up to 2022. So hopefully when COVID ends. So we are proposing within our group to extend this policy and especially make this policy progressive based on the income of the family. So if a family is, for example, if a family is average after 2022, can have still 50, 60, 70% of a tax refund when they are renovating their building as it was until last year. If a family is in energy poverty, or if someone is doing it on a building that is rented by energy poor people, might have access to 100% of the refund or more than 100% in order to be motivated to perform the building renovation. Sorry.
Great. Thank you. And there's just maybe one last question. You mentioned social housing and that some of the people experiencing energy poverty are in social housing. So Nathalie Hortar is asking, to what extent is there a housing park based on social housing? And Rehab is asking, are there specific efficiency measures or standards that could be focused on social housing? So maybe a specific policy around passive cooling or better insulation of social housing as a priority for the state?
At the moment, there is no minimum energy need for social housing, so no minimum energy requirements for social housing. So the problem is that there is no motivation in renovating them. However, the Italian plan for the next generation Europe that is related to COVID recovery and so on has addressed 16 billion euros to home renovation, and this includes social housing. It's not separate expenditure, so it's together with private sector, but also for the public sector, and especially for social housing, these funds can be used, and this tax refund that is dedicated to the private sector can be used also for social housing. So there are already some Italian municipalities, especially big municipalities, that are addressing some of these funds to social housing. It's quite difficult because we were speaking with the municipality of Milan, I think 3 years ago, to perform a project, especially with social housing owned by the municipality. And what the person responsible, the director of social housing for Milan, told us that he's an architect specialized in urbanistic. He's also a professor at university in this field. He told us that it was much more expensive to make social housing more efficient than to just make it so destroy the house and rebuild it. But that was then a social issue, because also to perform these big works, you had to evict people for a while, find an alternative solution where to put people while you are doing either the renovation or rebuild the building, and then put them back in their own context. And the other issue was related to the fact that, especially for Milan, I don't know for other places, social housing in some cases was signed many years ago. So we have old people living in big social housing flats that are poor in terms of efficiency, but you can't move those people because you create a social issue because they have lived there maybe for 30 or 40 years, so they are inserted in their area, they have all their needs and their friends and family over there. And so the issue becomes more related both to the home renovation, but also there is a social issue related to the renovation of social housing.
Yeah, and that question of housing surface is also a very important one when it comes to housing size, when it comes to heating and cooling. Thank you so much, Anna, for your talk and that nice discussion. I'm now going to give the floor to Altan Sahin, who is going to present a visual language for energy poor households in contexts where people speak different languages. How do you address energy poverty through visual aids? Altan, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Many greetings from Vienna. My name is Altan Sain. I am part of the Austrian Energy Agency, and the main focus of my work lies in directly working with consumers and behavior change. And today I would like to introduce you to our activities in one of our current Horizon 2020 projects. I'll share my presentation now. So in our project named EMPOWER, we are working on visual language for energy poor households, and with which we want to facilitate the communication with affected households, and thereby encouraging the support and also the implementation of awareness-raising measures. I would like to elaborate a bit more on our project EMPOWER in general. Its full title is Actions to Mitigate Energy Poverty in the Private Rented Sector. And energy poverty is a critical factor to achieve a fair energy transition, but it still remains on high levels in Europe because of increasing energy costs and also the slow progress in increasing energy efficiency in general. And mitigating energy poverty in the private rented sector is a particular challenge due to the difficulty to identify and quantify energy poor households in this sector, and also the difficulty to actually support these households with energy efficiency measures due to structural problems like the lack of information or the different incentives of tenants and landlords and similar problems. So in our project, we want to tackle both of these challenges, making energy poverty in the private rented sector more visible, and also test and implement measures to promote energy efficiency in order to alleviate energy poverty. Another goal is to increase the capacity of decision makers to understand and mitigate energy poverty by designing and implementing 10 different measures in 7 countries in Europe. These measures include grants for renovation or refurbishments, training and information offers, and also program support measures like guidelines for the identification of energy poverty. Another important outcome of our project will be the European-wide GIS-based tool, the Energy Poverty Dashboard, which will consist of 2 main elements. The first one being an online map showing the geography of energy poverty in the rented sector and where possible in the private rented sector, specifically for European countries. And this will allow the visualization of target groups, a range of indicators, and structural factors, and it will be based on statistical data from the European Energy Poverty Observatory and similar sources. The second main element of the dashboard will be an interactive map showing energy efficiency policies related to the private rented sector, as well as visual overviews of organizations related to energy poverty in each country, operating on different geographical scopes, from national to regional, and also on different operational scales. And on the next slide, you can see all the consortium members of EMPOWER. The project is coordinated by the Institute for European Energy and Climate Policy. Furthermore, we have various national energy agencies, universities, scientific institutions, NGO, and also, importantly, the International Union of Property Owners. Through their participation, we can make sure that we not only take into account the perspective of energy poor households themselves, but also that of landlords. And through this, we want to ensure that we can develop solutions that are working for both sides, and we can take into account the problems and perspectives of both parties. Now I would like to go into more detail about rainbow activities in Austria. Our aim here is to increase the ability to directly communicate with energy poor households with according measures. And there are already various support offers available from nationally to internationally, ranging from information material to counseling sessions and calculation tools. But they're often not insufficient because existing support and information formats are often not prepared in a suitable form, because our target group often lacks the time, resources, or educational background to really engage with sophisticated materials and tools. So our goal was to use visual language as a medium to directly communicate with energy poor households, avoiding language and information barriers. And for this purpose, we are using one of the central elements of MPOR, a co-creation process with local stakeholders in our country. In our case, this means a close collaboration with Eco Counseling in Vienna. They are offering advice on energy issues for many decades now, and are also specialized in working with energy poor households. So in our project, they bring in their extensive expertise in directly working with energy poor people, while we bring in our expertise in behavior change and awareness raising. However, the goal of our project is not to reinvent the wheel. Rather, we want to build on already existing materials whose content is already relevant for energy poor households, and make this information more accessible by means of visualization. And we also want, or will involve energy poor households directly in our development process. After we have finished the design of our new materials, with a strong focus on visual elements, we are going to test them directly in practice in counseling sessions of our local partner. This way we can obtain the feedback of the advised persons on the comprehensibility of the new materials, and also evaluate whether the redesign with a strong visual focus actually represents an added value for them or not. And our aim is to have 50 test counseling sessions in Vienna, with Vienna being the federal state in Austria with the highest share of people at risk of poverty. And originally I had plans to present our finalist materials here today, but unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, there were some delays in our project and we are still in the developing process. However, we plan to finish our final graphical design over the summer. And one of the main bases for our idea was the fact that solutions for energy poor households to reduce their energy consumption and their energy cost need to be cheap and easy to implement. And we also wanted to focus on tips that can increase their well-being without any need for major investments. Because many energy poor people are already trying to save energy, but often by sacrificing living comfort for it. This is something that we wanted to counteract. And another important fact to consider was that many people affected by energy poverty are not digital natives. For example, elderly people, and especially elderly women, as they are often affected by old age poverty. So it was important to make sure that our new designs are also well used in physical form. And another challenge was that we had to address was that the willingness to accept such support offers often heavily depends on a certain level of trust, because people who take advantage of such offers fear of being afraid of being stigmatized as being poor. So this can even lead to them straightforward refusing direct financial support. So it was important to have a partner on board who already enjoys much trust on this area, which we achieved thanks to eco-counseling. Through this, we also wanted to make sure that we meet the challenge of energy poverty as a multidimensional problem and not just see the whole topic from a pure energy perspective, but also take into account the social problems behind it. And as I have already mentioned, our proposed solution to increase the accessibility of already available offers is to put more focus on visual elements. In our case, this means pictograms, because pictograms can speak more than 1,000 languages. And we are planning to create fact sheets about the 3 topics of saving electricity, saving water, and also healthy living through proper heating and cooling. And in the course of our development process, we basically took already used information material of our partner Eco-Counseling and extracted different easy to implement energy saving tips from them, and on this basis created a new design with a strong focus on visual elements with as less text as possible. And in the end, a graphical professional will finalize this into proper fact sheets. And on the bottom of this slide, you can see on the left an exemplary excerpt from one of the materials that we used as a basis. And it shows information on proper ventilation. And on the right, you can see how we would like to try to show this information in a more compact way. And the idea will be to really mainly use elements like you can see here on the bottom right on our new fact sheets. And as I have told you before, there is also a form of evaluation foreseen in our development process through the feedback of consulted households. This way we want to obtain feedback on various indicators like the relevance of the contents, the type of the information shown, or the type of information presentation, and also the comprehensibility. For this purpose, the advisors who will conduct our test counseling sessions will directly document the feedback. And through the ongoing consultations of our partner, we will also be able to assess whether there were any long-term changes in behavior and if there were any measurable increases in the well-being of the households through our tips and fact sheets. And afterwards, when the development of the fact sheets is finalized, we will communicate the results to various multipliers in Austria and also make them free available, both on the energy and also in the social sectors. And another advantage of our redesign is that they decrease the language barriers and reduce translation work. So it would also be more easily possible for other organizations to use these materials internationally. And another aim of our project is to use partner organizations to replicate this intervention nationwide. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I hope our concept was interesting for you. And hopefully we will be able to present our finalized results on another occasion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Altan. It seems that some people had a bit of the problem with the sound, unfortunately. It wasn't clear for everyone. I could hear you, but maybe you've presented a tool that you developed to address the problem of energy poverty through visual methods. Maybe you can summarize a little bit what you see as what you learned from the process, and maybe in terms of learning, maybe you can say something about what works and what really doesn't work in terms of the co-design process. Any learnings you have, that would be nice to share.
Yeah, I think the first and one of the most important learnings for us was that through the direct cooperation with an organization which really regularly is in direct contact with energy poor households, as they're specialized in counseling them, we learned that there is, or that we underestimated that there is still quite a big gap in knowledge for many people who are affected by energy poverty, because many are already trying to save energy to reduce their cost, but still they're trying to do it sometimes in an, let's say, inefficient way, as there are, for example, households who are trying to decrease their heating costs by heating their flats with their oven or similar things. And these are often, I'd say, the type of information that is not addressed. Basic information is often not addressed in this kind of counseling sessions, I'd say. And this was one of the first, let's say, lessons that we learned. Another one was that there was already a need identified for a different approach in communicating with affected households, because, I mean, Vienna is maybe a special case, but because in Vienna there is quite a high share of people living here with migration background. So there is often a higher language barrier, let's say, in trying to directly assist these households. So there was already a need identified for taking a different approach, trying a different language, let's say, that we already experienced in other projects before when we were working with all energy advisors. So, but there was the opportunity lacking, the funding lacking for this type of new approaches. So we tried to test this out, and this was a good opportunity because this way we were also able to directly implement it with an evaluation process, because this will be directly tested in counseling sessions after the design is finished. So we are still not, I'd say, we are still not finished currently with the project. It's still going on, and the evaluation phase itself is has not taken place yet. So we will still have our main learnings probably later this year, because we really want to have the direct feedback from the affected households.
And how do you account for other aspects? So language is accounted for, but what about gender, age? I'm sure in terms of visual representation, age is important. Is this, have you considered this as well?
Yeah, so what we try to focus on is to design them in a way that they are usable for non-digital natives. This is something where we really try to respect the age factor, let's say, because the situation in Austria is quite different in the urban and rural area. In the urban area, there are more younger people affected by poverty or energy poverty specifically, and in rural areas, there are more elderly people affected. So what we really would need to do is actually design different types of information material for these different target groups. For Vienna now, which is our target region for this project, we were focusing more on tips in a language, let's say, that is more appropriate for a younger target group or young adults, I'd say. Okay. Because in Vienna we have like the situation that more single parent households are affected by energy poverty. And so, for example, we also took into account to integrate information that how they could try to reduce energy consumption for gaming consoles of the children, which is probably not so important information for elderly people, but this is how we tried to at least implement some target group specific information here and respect this factor.
And a last question maybe from Riham, who is asking, this seems to be very much based on an information deficit model. but the issue of energy poverty is much more systemic. Is there a way that your research addresses this? So not just trying to give people more information to behave better, but accounting for complexity?
This is also something that we are going to target in our project, not specifically in this action, I'd say, because in our project we are directly targeting the private rented sector, which already has its, I'd say, specific problems like split incentives, where the most appropriate solution to increase energy efficiency in homes would be more thermal refurbishment. But the owners are responsible for this problem, but the tenants are the ones who are gaining the benefit out of it through reduced energy costs.
Yes.
This is something that, of course, cannot be really. This is, I think, one of the most important systemic challenges here, but of course, something that we can't really target with this kind of measure. But we believe that it's important to also address empowerment in this context and give people options how they could improve their situations themselves, measures they could conduct themselves. But of course, the systemic challenge is also present, but not really, I'd say, our main focus point.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. I think there are no more further questions. So, and no special requests for discussion. So we could end a bit earlier if you prefer, or does anyone here in our panel want to raise any topic for discussion? It was a nice overview of the issues related to dynamics of inclusion and exclusion. Any preferences from Anna, Rehab, or Altan? No.
I just have a comment though. I think from even the discussions yesterday, one of the things that quite struck me was the idea of defining energy, energy access, efficiency, energy poverty. And I think, it's a lot of the research that we're doing is kind of based around assumptions around what those needs are, when we say basic needs or well-being, there are certain studies that we look at, but then even then these are such complex issues that I think we really need to think about how we can define them. And of course, the context is so important. So at what level do we look at when we are talking about energy poverty and energy access, and what is the context? So yeah, I mean, if anybody has any ideas around that, or if there are any studies specifically that do address this issue, it would be great to know about them.
No, you're right, Rehab, and how we define reveals something about the frameworks we use to understand problems. And then after we've defined, there's the question of how do you measure and how do you operationalize those definitions? And we heard yesterday different approaches to well-being that can be both quantitative and qualitative. So it's a big question. Do others want to comment on that, Altan or Anna?
Yes, maybe regarding, because you said well-being, this was an important keynote in my presentation, which many people did not hear, but I believe that when we are looking at energy poverty, as we should look at it as a multidimensional problem, as you already said. And I think the well-being of the affected people is a factor that is often kind of left out, giving them tools to increase also their well-being. And this is also something that we try to look at, or try to target in our project, giving them opportunities or telling them about opportunities, how they also increase, not also decrease their energy consumption, but also increase their well-being at home at the same time. And defining energy poverty is quite a difficult task. I think here in Austria, we are on the political level, they are already working since 10 years to get an official definition for energy poverty. And it's still going on. There's still not an official definition up to date, which is also a reason why there are still no targeted subsidies or other support offers here yet.
Yeah, also the European Commission recently published a document on energy poverty saying that since it's a complex problem, we cannot find a common definition. So let's just use the indicators that are here that are proposed by the Energy Poverty European Observatory, that are a bunch of indicators about everything. and consider all the aspects without considering just one of them, because otherwise we don't understand the phenomenon in its complexity and its all aspects.
Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, why do we need a universal definition? So, I mean, perhaps, what this shows us is that we don't really need to have a universal definition or even a national definition, but that it needs to be broad enough to incorporate all of these different aspects, and it needs to be defined within a certain context so that it can address the issues within that context. So maybe diversity is the key here.
Absolutely, and it goes well with the theme of the panel today. Diversity and how they're revealed through practices and actual either observations or different indicators that Anna used or participative methods that we saw with Altan. So, well, thank you all so much for this very nice panel. And we have now about a 40-minute break, and we pick up again at 12:30 CET, where Marta will host the Zoom and I'll be on Whova. So I look forward to seeing all of you a bit later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.